Welcome to the Hudson Institute. I'm Bryan Clark, a senior fellow at the Institute and director of the Hudson Center for Defense Concepts and Technology. I'd like to welcome you all here today for a discussion about electromagnetic spectrum operations and the implementation of the Department of Defense's electromagnetic spectrum superiority strategy. I'm joined today for this discussion by Steve Tango Tarango of Reginald Victor Jones Institute, an institute devoted to the furtherance of electromagnetic spectrum operations and examining how we can do better in that mission area. So Tango, thank you for being here today. We're also joined by a great panel that we're honored to have with us to talk about this subject. First, Brigadier General AnnMarie Anthony is the Deputy Director of Operations for Joint Electromagnetic Spectrum Operations and the Mobilization Assistant to the Director of Operations at U.S. Strategic Command. She is the operational lead for electromagnetic spectrum operations in the Department of Defense. She leads the Joint Electromagnetic Warfare Center, as well as the Joint Electromagnetic Preparedness for Advanced Combat Organization, so JEPIC. So two organizations that are key to the departments being able to do better in the electromagnetic spectrum. David Tremper is the Director for Electromagnetic Warfare, supporting the Platforms and Weapons Portfolio Manager in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, where he is in charge of essentially the Pentagon's efforts to improve its capabilities in the electromagnetic spectrum and to advance the capabilities necessary for superiority in the spectrum. And last but not least, we're joined by Colonel William Young, Dollar, call sign, who is the commander of the 350th Spectrum Warfare Wing at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, which is the organization in the Air Force that has 8 units at 3 locations throughout the United States. It's responsible for providing electromagnetic spectrum capabilities to both the United States Air Force as well as partner and allied electromagnetic warfare systems. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the work that they do there, which is a really interesting set of capabilities for reprogramming and analyzing our operations in the spectrum. So thank you very much to our panelists for all being here today. We really appreciate it. So to start off with, we are going there. The congressional members are going through the budget and the authorizations for next year's budget right now, and there's a lot of discussion about where we should be prioritizing our efforts. Congress wants to add money to increase the military's capability and capacity. But what's driving a lot of this is the war in Ukraine, creating concerns about Russia's improved capability and belligerence, but more importantly, China. And in terms of the electromagnetic spectrum, China has been expanding and modernizing its electromagnetic warfare capabilities for a decade now plus. How are we doing in our ability to counter China, be able to deal with China in electromagnetic spectrum, and fight in an increasingly contested and congested battle space when it comes to the spectrum? And I'll start with you, General Anthony, since this is your portfolio. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you very much for having us. I always enjoy talking about electromagnetic spectrum operations. So you ask a very good question. And I think one thing that all of us here can agree upon is that superiority in the spectrum, it can no longer be taken for granted. There are definite challenges, and we know that we have vulnerabilities. And so one thing you brought up in your opening remarks, the EMS Superiority Strategy and Implementation Plan, that is such an important effort that the department has right now, because that is how we will be able to maintain our military overmatch in the spectrum, carrying out all of those tasks, making sure that each part of the Department of Defense does what they need to do. It's such a great mechanism because it is DoD wide, it is synchronized, and it will help us ensure that we can maintain that superiority over any adversary.
And so the Spectrum Superiority Strategy came out, I guess, 2 years ago now. And it really was kind of a watershed moment because it did highlight how we needed to shift the focus from just sort of a system versus system battle in the spectrum and just continue to get better countermeasures to adversaries' radars and better radars against adversaries' jammers, to instead think more broadly about the spectrum and being able to use maneuverability and deception and some other techniques to be able to get an advantage there. Is that something that you have your organizations looking specifically at as this new strategic approach to fighting in the spectrum?
Most definitely. So, part of, I think one thing too, is even before the superiority strategy, there was a a joint pub 3-85 that brought together spectrum management and EW. So that is really EMSO. So I look at spectrum management or spectrum operations as how do we maneuver through the spectrum? As you just mentioned, we need to maneuver through the spectrum. And then the EW part is that fires aspect. So we had, already those seeds were kind of being planted of getting to the combination of fires and maneuvers, and then the EMS superiority strategy. You're right, that was September of 20, and then the implementation plan. And I always go back and like to emphasize the implementation plan, because I say a strategy is only worth the paper it's printed upon if you don't have a way to actually realize a strategy. And Secretary Austin signing out that implementation plan last July is so important, because that is how we're going to realize EMS superiority and the ability to do those both fires and maneuvers in the spectrum.
Yeah, and that brings up a question for Mr. Tremper. So, Dave, how are we doing at implementing the strategy in terms of the programs we're developing and the systems and the advancements of those systems that we're trying to field over the next 5 to 10 years?
I think there's a couple of things going on. I think in terms of the programs, we're starting to get a very clear recognition about where big R and little r, the gap between big R and little r, right? So what I'm talking about there is the big R, which is the strategic capability need that's coming out of the COCOMs, coming from the Joint Staff, saying these are the strategic capability needs that we have, and how those capabilities are being translated into service programmatic requirements. And so very often what we're starting to see is that there's gaps forming there in certain areas that we're becoming cognizant of that we need to pay special attention to. And I think some of the gaps that we're seeing, and they're coming, the lessons learned are coming out of exercises, are on that EMS survivability front. And I think anybody who's heard me talk hears me tout EP, because I feel like over the past 15 to 20 years, we've degraded an EP, mainly because there wasn't really a lot of oversight on EP, despite it being Wikipedia part of EW, right? EP is actually the onus of the radar developers, the comms developers, and the PNT developers. And so historically, what I've been seeing is that when we have a conversation about EMS survivability, it immediately migrates towards EW. And the question is, EW, how are you going to achieve EMS survivability? And how does our EW map against their EW? And what I've been pointing out is that our EW systems don't attack their EW systems. Our EW systems attack their radars, their comms, and their PNT. So the question we should be asking is, how do our systems stand up to EW attack, right? How do our radars perform? How do our comms perform? How do our PNT perform? And I think when we observe operations in the Ukraine, we see what the impact of that. We see what's the impact of assured comms, right? You've heard me talk about Starlink in the past. Assured comms has a particularly important aspect to warfare, and I think it'll be interesting to see what the analysis coming out of the Ukraine says about the significance of assured comms in a contested environment. And so I think when you start to see that, and we see things like EMS survivability showing up in the requirements process, and we see exercises showing what the vulnerabilities are when our EMS using systems are exposed to EW, then we're starting to get that senior level attention. We're starting to get the requirements that people's feet are being held to the fire, that they need to address EMS survival. They need to be EP cognizant. I think we're starting to get to a degree of EP awareness and kind of self-assessment that is extraordinarily important. Where this maps into the implementation plan is that when we've talked about those types of problems in, say, the EW XCOM, we were within an EW community talking about the challenges to radars, comms, and PNT. There was not an off-ramp to those communities that would say, hey, we, the EW people, are telling you need to fix your radars, because anybody who's been in the EW community knows that there's stovepipes across those communities, and it's kind of why don't you deal with your EW, I'll deal with my radar, I'll deal with my comms. What the EMS superiority strategy and subsequently the implementation plan led to was the creation of the EMS senior steering group. And the EMS senior steering group effectively takes it outside of the EW purview and creates the connective tissue across the EMS using communities, whether those are the comms command and control leadership board, so that's more the comm side, the PNT advisory board, which is on the PNT side. That now the EWXCOM can take the lessons learned about what EW effects had on radars, comms, and PNT, bring them to the EMS senior steering group and say, this is what we saw in EW. Please share these with the other EMS communities. And instead of the EW community engaging the PNT community or engaging the comms community, where we've historically seen obstacles and roadblocks and stiff arms. Now we see more of the connective tissue organization of the EMS senior steering group delivering that message, and it's being more receptive. Those communities are more receptive to essentially that overarching EMS perspective of survivability, and we're seeing action taken on how to address it. So I think from a programmatic perspective, we're seeing the requirements migrate to EMS survivability, so that now the EW community can highlight where we have EP vulnerabilities. And now we have the infrastructure created through the implementation plan that allows that message to be propagated across EMS users, and then action to be taken and not perceived as an aggressive move on one community or another.
Which is great. It's great to see that progress, because I know when I was in the building, that was a lot of the frustration we had, was getting the cooperation to happen between different EMS portfolios. So one question I had on that is, we're working on a paper we're going to finish on electromagnetic protection, based in part on research that we did, that you helped with on the workshops we did earlier last year. And one of the interesting areas that came out of those discussions that you had led part of is that it's partly about these other communities making their systems more hardened or more survivable in a contested environment. It's also about being able to be more tactically astute about how you employ your systems to avoid detection, because if you can avoid detection, perhaps you can avoid jamming. So there's tactics and con ops involved, but then there's also the idea of making your system less detectable. So it's not just a matter of hardening it, but it's also trying to avoid the jammer or avoid the countermeasure in the first place. That's also something that's going into this calculation. So survivability is a combination of factors. It's not just a matter of making the system a harder target.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that drives us towards, I think historically we've viewed EW as a very tactical problem, platform self-defense, right? All these things. I think as we're seeing very long-range kill chains that are enabled by what are traditionally strategic sensors, space and over-the-horizon sensors, right? It's kind of opened up the canvas on where do we need to deliver EW effects and when do we need to deliver them, right? And so to prevent some of those long-range kill chains, it's not just dealing with the terminal phase of the missile, it's actually dealing with the entire kill chain that has become very short timeline, right? It's very quick to go from a space sensor now to a terminal phase on a missile, and we have to be able to deal with that whole threat. I think we're seeing a migration towards that. We're seeing those aspects being factored into how we develop our countermeasures, which has changed the perspectives, has changed the requirements, has changed the delivery platforms, but it's also highlighted a lot of common threats across the services. So where we historically viewed tactical EW from a Navy perspective predominantly as ship defense or tactical aircraft defense, now when we view countering strategic sensors, those impacts have joint force implications. And those effects can be delivered whether you're on land or you're on sea or you're in the air. And so we're starting to very closely observe, how can I take a capability from one service that addresses some of those threats and migrate them across the other services. And this is where things that Dollar Young is working in the 350 Spectrum Wing become extraordinarily important, right? And the missionware and non-kinetic arsenals, where if I can create a capability as an app and I have deployed systems that can accept those apps, then I can deliver that effect from an aircraft, I can deliver it from a ground vehicle, I can deliver it from a Navy ship. We're trying to take what Dollar has created in the 350th Spectrum Warfare Wing, migrate that concept across the services, and then enable them with things like the Army's CMOS, Government Reference Architecture, the Air Force's SOSA. Make sure that we have alignment there, so that when the Navy develops a capability, it's of value across the joint forces, particularly when it's going against a common threat, which has historically been something more strategic.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. And that's a great segue, obviously, to Dollar and the work that he's doing down there in terms of creating more distributed architectures and more open architectures for electromagnetic spectrum operations. So Dollar, how is that? How are you doing that? And how is that going in terms of implementing this more distributed approach to EM spectrum operations that allows these long-range kill chains that also have this effect of improving EMS survivability, right? So if I can spread out my EM spectrum activity, I can probably reduce the vulnerability of any particular player in that network. So how is that going, and how are you pursuing that?
Yeah, hi, Brian, and thanks for allowing me the opportunity to be on a panel with such a great group of leaders, both General Anthony and Mr. Tremper, phenomenal leaders that are taking our entire department and services forward, and that's exciting. And so before I get to your question, what I'd like to do is maybe step back a little bit and reinforce some of the previously made comments. But by maybe wrapping it up by saying it takes a system to beat a system. And where I am so excited about what we are on the verge of now together is that from my seat, we are working together as a service and as a joint force and as a DoD at a level that I've never seen across my 31-year career. And that also includes into industry. And being able to I think we are all slowly aligning and understanding the strategic imperative that has been voiced by our senior-most leaders. And I see us talking less and doing more. So in terms of what we are doing at the Spectrum Warfare Wing, we are partnered again across the labs, across industry, across the services to really get after. Mr. Tremper brought up this notion of missionware or apps for airplanes. So let's just anchor there for just a minute. And of course, in terms of technical precision, it's not exactly an app for an airplane, but functionally, that's close enough to have the discussion. And so what we are doing is we are taking capabilities that have existed and pockets of excellence, so that there's no doubt in my mind that we have the smarts to do this at scale. But the challenge has been integration. So that term has come up a couple of times already. And so my direction from my 4-star, General Kelly at Commander of Air Combat Command, is that we are the services integrator and deliverer of EMS capability. So now as that capability begins to take the form of missionware, which gives us the ability to change the behavior of the hardware or the underlying hardware without swapping it out or changing the OFP operational flight program very, very rapidly by the introduction of the missionware layer. So you could think of it as the missionware sits on top of the OFP, which drives the underlying hardware. And so we're gonna hopefully continue to learn ways to acquire hardware faster. And then we'll get better at OFP development. Again, folks are working on that, but it's the addition of the missionware, which in the field, increasingly closer and closer to the edge, gives us the ability to change the behavior of our underlying systems. The reason why that matters is that now it gives, in our service, it gives those local commanders tools to execute mission type orders. And that's very, very powerful because it adds optionality in terms of what an adversary has to counter. And so we are working through that. We are a great multidisciplinary team that's getting after that every day. And I'm super excited because we're coming up on next week, a flight demo of exactly that capability that does the equivalent of taking Android apps and running them on an iPhone. So that's again, the high level sort of description of what we're doing. But what it looks like is specifically we're taking 4 app-like capabilities, 1 built by industry, 2 built by the Air Force, 1 built by the Navy, and being able to fly that on an architecture that was never built to support those. So that's the concrete thing that actually implements what Mr. Tremper was describing in terms of missionware. And we're just scratching the surface of that. And so I'm so excited because it's not just our organization in isolation. It's the entire ecosystem getting after this problem. And I think what's been missing in the past is that you never really had that sort of operational unit to transition all the greatness that exists in the silos of excellence and couple that with a warfighter need and do that in near mission planning timelines. And so as we get to do that more and more and scale that, I think that is potentially a game changer in the EMS.
Yeah, great point. Tango, you got a question to jump in there? I have a couple more, so go ahead.
Great, thanks. Yeah, Dollar, I had the opportunity to be at the AOC's Kitty Hawk Week last week, where the AFRL Sensors Directorate kind of opened the kimono and talked all about the work that they're doing. And I think 90% of it tied directly to supporting the Spectrum Warfare Wing and where we're going. Great stuff to see. I was excited about that. The question then is, and you briefly mentioned the Navy, how are you tying to the other services labs? And what is your impression of their interest in joining into the fight?
Yeah, thanks, Tango, for that great question, and thanks for your continued support to the community. It goes back to my earlier point about partnerships across all of the services, and at our level, we are collaborating. I work a lot with Tanker Thomas, Gerardo Garcia out at Point Magoo. We actually have folks from the Army's Reprogramming Center embedded in our 453rd Electronic Warfare Squadron in San Antonio. And so all the pieces are there. It's not as advanced and moving as scale. So we're lacking the speed, scale, and scope today, but all the initial min viable products are there today. And all we need to do is, again, integrate and deliver them. And what's exciting about that is that this is not just long range stuff. This is stuff here today. And so beginning to think in terms of how do we optimize our fielded capability today? If we have to fight tonight, how can we bring capabilities to bear that we otherwise wouldn't have been available to us? And that's what we're doing. And we're working our way through this. As we start to think about, Bryan, your cutting edge work along with Dan Pat on Mosaic Warfare. We're making that real. This is how you actually do that. And so sharing, so things like sharing our Spectre, our common integrated reprogramming platform of government reference architecture, sharing that and making it available to the other services. And then not only the other services, but also our partners and allies. And it's just initial stages now, but you can imagine how, given the proper leadership emphasis, we can turn this into capability very, very rapidly. And I would point to concrete to that. Again, our Project 212, which is our missionware, which not only takes advantage of missionware, but leverages stitches, one of our other IOC MVP deliverables. So, a year ago, people were saying, hey, Dollar, I don't know what the heck you're talking about, but now we're starting to show them. And again, it's not a slam on them for not understanding. This is highly technical work, but it's also highly operationally, it requires operational level insights. And so to be able to pull those together, I think that's really the part of the beauty of the design of the Spectrum Warfare Wing. So to have one foot in ops, but then an entire group dedicated to research and engineering. And so you had the opportunity to hear from Colonel Spear Mintz, who's my 850th Spectrum Warfare Group Commander, which is my research and engineering group. But I think what's powerful, and you brought this up, the fact that AFRL, ROI, the Spectrum Superiority Division, is tightly coupled with us. So that's, again, a concrete example of this pairing and the goodness that occurs when you put ops with research and engineering and the labs and our industry partners, what we're capable of doing.
Dollar, that's a terrific encapsulation of where you're going, and and I think the move towards more recomposable, adaptable spectrum warfare operations is essential when you're going up against an adversary like China that's got numerical superiority and a home team advantage. So it seems like we have to move that direction. So General Anthony, a question for you that comes out of that is, this seems very consistent with the superiority strategy, and so the GEMSO concept, this idea that we need to have integration of spectrum capabilities at the point of operations, not being done through the acquisition process, but instead being done out at the near the point of use. So as close to mission time as possible. We're going to compose these units, compose their operations in the spectrum, and then deliver the kinds of effects that are needed against a particular set of targets. Is this the direction you see DoD needing to go to be able to get superiority in the spectrum when you're up against opponents like China that have the, kind of the home field advantage and a lot of capacity on their side?
So most definitely. And so, going back to my very first comment when you asked the first question is superiority of the spectrum can no longer be taken for granted. And another thing I also like to say is that there's only one spectrum. So everybody's using the same spectrum. And when you're looking at operations and we're looking at how, train like you fight, we need to start making sure that EMSO is part of everything. It's not something that you just kind of band-aid on at the very end. And that goes through the entire, if you look at the definition of EMSO, that starts with what Dave Tremper said about electromagnetic protection. How are we making sure that our systems, before they even get to the fight, that they are protected and able to maneuver through a contested and congested spectrum. So first, and then you look at, okay, we've got our electromagnetic support. What do we know about our adversary? What is their EMSO scheme of maneuver? How are we going to make sure that we're at an advantage, and how are we going to put them in as a disadvantage? Spectrum management. I hear a lot of people talk about spectrum management. I like to call it spectrum operations. How are we going to dynamically maneuver through the spectrum to a point where it's advantageous for us, and then put the adversary in a disadvantaged situation? And then, of course, there's always what everybody thinks about when they hear EMSO is electromagnetic attack. Let's go and jam. Let's go and, that sort of thing. But I think we have to have all of that. It has to be integrated, and it has to start with our training. So if you look at some of the things that we at STRATCOM have responsibility for, joint force training standards for EMSO. What does the average joint force operator need to understand about EMSO? Getting that training at the very beginning, at your sessions, getting the training as you go through, your initial weapon system training, and having that reoccurring training so you understand. Starting at the training, and then going through when you've learned the education portion. Now you're out in live fly exercises. You're actually going into a contested and congested environment and testing out everything and preparing, and then all the way into when you have to actually employ it for real. So it has to be completely embedded and in part of our entire a thought process, just not a Band-Aid that you put on at the very end.
Yeah, and it seems like the way that Dollar's talking about it is we need to be when you put together a mission package out in the field and you're trying to use capabilities like stitches and some of these other interoperability tools to join up your composure force packages before you use it. That's all spectrum operations that have to be managed before you even start the takeoff and begin the operation.
Bryan, I'd like to foot stomp General Anthony's training point, right? So that is extraordinarily important, that we put operators in environments that are challenged in the spectrum so that they can work through it, right? So the operators are smart, they're innovative, they know their systems, right? I've used examples in the past where 15 years ago a high priority problem showed up. The department reviewed it, said we need to throw a lot of money at a material solution for this, and there was a lot of concern about it. I ended up in the back of a tactical platform. I was watching an operator who had already figured out a workaround for that problem and was training his subordinates how to work around that problem. And I took the message back into the Beltway that, hey, we're throwing hundreds of millions of dollars at this problem, and we put it in front of an operator who figured out a workaround, right? And he's sharing that workaround. I think we're starting to see a lot of emphasis now on creating contested environments and maintaining them. Right, not just saying, hey, this is what it looks like, and then turning it off so they can carry out the mission, but saying, no, you have to carry out the mission in this environment. And I think that we've gotten to the point where we're enforcing contested operations. We're enforcing them to work through that environment. I think that is profoundly important for EMS survivability, is getting the operators in the know on what to expect, how to use their systems in those environments, and giving them a chance to work around it.
So let's also tie that back to what we're doing in the spectrum warfare wing, because I think it's a great partnership. Because now, as you start to throw operators in these environments, then now that generates a demand signal. And if we can very rapidly think hours, put in their hands an MVP, fast, cheap, and quick, that allows them to play and understand, if I had this capability at scale, I would be able to tackle it. So it's not just the TTPs, which heretofore, our only way to improve our standing in the very near term was through TTP development. So again, that training. But now what we're saying is not only are we going to do that and do that at a higher level, but we're going to add the ability to generate, to provide new capabilities very, very rapidly. And again, it will not boil the ocean. That's not what we're saying. That's not even what you want to do. You want to put in their hands a min viable product, which allows them to learn, but then also it gives us feedback that we can then figure out, hey, what would it take to go from a min viable product to a min viable capability release? And so a min viable capability release is that product or service that allows you to actually move the needle in terms of your mission accomplishment. And so now think about being able to do that very, very rapidly across all the services at scale and doing that every single day. How good would our force get?
Yeah.
And so that also allows us to get into a cycle of iron sharpens iron, right? So this is where EW contributes to EP, is that we can take our EW assets out there and exercise them against our EMS using systems, right? So we learn from the EW side effectiveness. They learn from their side EP and operations and vulnerabilities. And then we get into this good cycle of iron sharpens iron. We can refine our EW, we can improve our EW, and vice versa. We can improve our EP and our EMS survivability.
Without breaking the bank.
Right, which highlights the value of tactics and ConOps and just LPI, LPD as a technique to manage EP, to achieve EP. So question for Dave and for General Anthony is, are we investing in the kind of LVC capabilities that would allow us to do this sort of ConOps and TTP exploration without having to do it in a live range where it takes forever to set up an exercise? Because it seems like the way that Dollar's describing it, we're going to be doing these mission integrations at the tactical edge. You're not going to have the ability to go off and play with the systems to see if you got a good ConOp. You need to have some kind of LVC capability that allows you to explore that and then build the mission package out of that. Are we investing in that kind of capability?
So I'll start. So I can't comment on what the services. I will allow the services to comment on how they're investing with their budgets, but we do have a responsibility as the lead operator for electromagnetic spectrum enterprise to provide the requirement. And so if you go back to my comment of, hey, if we're setting the Joint Force training standards and what the Joint Force needs to train to, that then drives a requirement that then the services go, okay, I see what we need to invest in. I see the type of ranges that we need to have. And we most definitely have to have the ranges, as Dave said, to go out and do that training, that contested, congested environment throughout our operations. So the operator gets very comfortable with seeing it. It becomes just naturally part of what they do. So we, through, the Joint Force training standards, through the assessing and the accreditation of the Joint Force that we're going to be doing, out of that will become requirements that we have a responsibility to hand on to the services so they know what to build towards.
Yeah, and I'll add on that we've seen budget increases over the past few cycles in the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation to address some of these challenges, like to create credibility in our ranges, to create effectiveness in our ranges, to assess operator training, to assess the capabilities of our systems. So we have seen over the past few cycles budget increases aligned with creating more relevant environments in this regard, and tying in the LVC aspect of that about how do you take live, how do you combine it with virtual, how do you connect all those dots so that you can create broader ranges, you can create effects without revealing capability. So we have seen improvements there.
And to Dave, the
Bryan,
modeling and simulation piece of this.
Go
ahead. That's what I was going to just turn to.
Yeah, I was just going to jump on. The Spectrum Warfare Wing is within the U.S. Air Force Warfare Center. And my boss, Major General Cunningham, has improving our virtual test and training as one of his lines of effort. So from an Air Force perspective within the Warfare Center, it is absolutely at the top of my boss's to-do list.
Excellent. Yeah, well, and that's what I was trying to get at. Is I think there's clearly, improving the live range experience is important, but increasingly we're probably going to have to rely on modeling and simulation if we're going to do the work that you're talking about, Dollar, which is relatively rapid turn development of min viable product type, techniques and capabilities or force compositions that all involve some kind of stitching together of a new set of capabilities in the spectrum. Tango, over to you. You had a question for Dave.
I did. I wanted to, as General Anthony mentioned the maneuver piece. Dave has been talking about developing multifunction capabilities that will allow us to maneuver through this space. I wanted to ask Dave, how has he seen any progress in the multifunction systems, multifunction apertures that are going to be needed to enable this maneuver?
Yeah, I have, right? So in terms of apertures, there's kind of a history there of good testing. Came up through the Navy. There's a program called Integrated Topside about how do you connect all the functionality behind a reduced number of apertures on a ship. There's test beds that exist for that. There's resource allocation manager efforts going on to how do you do the coordination of that. Seen a lot of progress in the Army. Both from S&T and on the acquisition side on multifunction. I know MFU Air Large is now flying around. The challenge is, how do you do the deconfliction of the spectrum using functions within that multifunction box? From a technical perspective, there's been a lot of progress in how do you get there. Now, not everything is going to combine together. A high power radar who operates in a narrow band is not going to be able to coexist probably on a wideband ES system that doesn't need much power. Right? So there's definitely some conflicts. We have a study going on within my office on the impacts of multifunction. One of the things we're paying close attention to, what's the acquisition impact of a multifunction system, right? That's actually disruptive to acquisition because of the cylinders of excellence across the EMS using acquisition programs. If I've got a multifunction system that's going to do comms and EW and SIGINT and maybe even some low power radar stuff, historically, those all exist as separate acquisition programs. They have separate contracts. They have separate pieces of hardware. They have separate requirements. As soon as we say we're going to acquire a multifunction system, well, then some acquisition program needs to own the hardware. And then other acquisition programs have to line up with what's their appendix requirements that pile on top of that generic hardware capability. And I'm paying close attention to what the Army is doing in this aspect because they are organizing themselves in some of their acquisition programs to enable that. They are identifying who's the acquisition program responsible for their hardware, what's the collective hardware requirements that they need to pursue, and then aligning below that, what are the functional requirements from the specific users, whether they're comms or EW or IO or SIGINT, that overlay on top of that multifunction hardware. Now, so that they're effectively, from my perspective, establishing a paradigm or a precedent on how you acquire multifunction systems, how you break down those cylinders of excellence, how do you prevent kind of hostility across the users. That's good going on in the Army. I've also seen that happening in the submarines, right? So the submarine radio room, if you've ever been in there, very tight, lots of EMS operations, all sharing masked space at periscope depth, right? They've from a submarine perspective been forced down that path, right? That they have to work together, that the comms users would prefer to reside on somebody else's hardware rather than bring their own hardware into that space. So we've been paying attention to how the submarine radio room is being architected to enable that multifunction capability, and how do then they pursue requirements for functional capabilities on top of shared hardware. So there is precedent being set. I think the Army very overtly is creating acquisition infrastructure to enable it. And we're paying attention to that so that we can start attempting to propagate that across the services, that approach.
Which is Dave, that's a great point. And so is part of this a function of the fact that the Army is pursuing, kind of at the base, a more distributed approach to spectrum operations? They've kind of disaggregated their systems to have the MPU family and then also air launched effects. It seems like they're trying to step back and start off with a new approach, which is more distributed, more disaggregated than maybe the more monolithic approach they had in past years, where they had kind of a single system, Duke or Crew, whatever, that was the mainstay. Now it seems like they're pursuing this portfolio that might force them to start thinking about multifunction systems because of the small form factors involved.
Yeah, I think so, but there's something I want to highlight here, and I'm going to end up on a soapbox about this, but there's an interesting thing. So I managed a lot of the counter radio controlled IED S&T work that was going on in the early 2000s, and at that time, the perspective was that the Army had divested in EW, right? And so the Navy EWOs had come in to help with the counter IED problem with the Army. And there was this perspective that the Army had to restart their EW. So fast forward 20 years and take a look back. What happened? Well, what happened is that the Army essentially started with a blank slate on how they develop and deploy EW systems. So they were looking at it through the lens of 2000 to 2010 technology. And what you end up with is software-defined systems, multifunction operations. So now the Army was able to recreate their entire electronic warfare strategy and base it on new technology. The opportunity to do that is fantastic, right? At the time it was, oh, the Army has divested in EW, now they got to play catch up. But in hindsight, what they got was an opportunity to restart with new technology, and they did it very effectively. And so now we're starting to see the product of that. We're seeing systems go into operational tests coming through acquisition that benefited from that restart. If you look at how the Navy does EW, right, you've got TAC air EW systems that are platform specific, surface platform specific, submarine specific, right? There is no really connective tissue across those. If the Navy, and this wouldn't happen, but if the Navy had to restart EW, you would start to see a very similar approach, I think, coming out of that process, where now we have a more collective mindset that an EW effect doesn't matter if it's on a TAC air platform or if it's on a surface platform, that you create it as essentially the path that dollar is going down as missionware that can be shared across platforms, very rapidly developed, very rapidly deployed. I think we're seeing the benefit that the Army got out of that restart now starting to really produce as things like MQ Air Large show up in operational tests.
Yeah, absolutely. A great point about the Navy. We just did a report on the Navy, on naval aviation, that highlighted how the monolithic platform approach the Navy's had with like the Growler and then the self-protection systems on platforms like submarines and ships has really driven it to the point where it's difficult for those systems to be able to generate offensive effects. They can protect themselves, but they're not really the kind of system you're going to send into a highly contested environment to generate an offensive effect, like against suppression of enemy air defenses or something. So General Anthony, are we in terms of thinking about what the JEPIC and Juke is doing and evaluating the capabilities of the force, are we seeing the need to start looking at the way the Army's doing business in the spectrum and maybe adopt that among the other services? Because when you look at operation or exercises in highly contested environments, it seems like it's going to be really hard for a platform like the Growler, which is a relatively high signature, relatively short range airplane, to get inside a highly contested environment and be able to deliver effects against air defenses and sensors and et cetera. We're going to have to move towards more of this disaggregated approach like the Army. Is that kind of the direction we see it going?
So I don't know about that, but I do have an approach that I talk about for getting after what you're talking about. And I think it goes back to, I mentioned earlier, is what is the adversary EMSO scheme of maneuver? So how are they going to try to deny us use of the spectrum where we want to use the spectrum? How are they, and where are they going to do that? And how are they going to integrate those capabilities? So really understanding the adversary and how they intend to deny us the ability to push in and operate through a contested and congested environment. And so then once we understand that, then we have to go back and say, okay, what is going to be our EMSO scheme of maneuver? What should we take out kinetically? What should we take out non-kinetically? What should we maybe just maneuver around? And then once we understand that, that's when we go and look at what type of capabilities do we need to invest in? Is it a large platform that we need to invest in? Maybe, maybe not. Is it a cyber EW capability? Maybe, maybe not. And so I think we have to, I have never heard Dave talk about the Army and their reset. And I found that really, really interesting. And I think as we go forward, especially with this renewed emphasis on EMS superiority, and then with the implementation plan, is to take a step back and say, okay, maybe let's not emphasize it has to be a platform. It has to be this. What effect are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to do? And then get a capability that helps us, an efficient and effective capability that helps us get that effect. So I hope that answers your question, kind of in a roundabout sort of way, but I wanted to walk it back a little bit.
No, that's a good point. I mean, and especially as the operational, executive agent, you should be thinking in those terms of like, what effects are we trying to generate? How are we trying to fight? What does that imply for requirements? And then it's somebody else's, job to kind of figure out how to combine systems to deliver those effects. Tango, you had a question. Tango.
I did for General Anthony. One of the taskings that you've got to deal with under the strategy and the implementation plan is to develop the Joint EMSO Center, or at least it's under Stratcom's purview. As we've been talking for years about the problem with EMSO is one of the big factors is governance. So how is their progress on the Joint EMSO Center going at this point?
So actually it's going really well. So we have, we have to do the implementation plan directed Stratcom to stand up the Joint EMSO Center. So we have that responsibility to carry out that task. And with it comes expanded authorities for Admiral Richard as Commander Stratcom that helps us get after EMS superiority through operations. So my folks, and this is, very basic, boring kind of, bureaucratic work, but we have drafted up an action memo. We have staffed it at the both the 06 and the 1-star, 2-star level throughout the department. Everybody is on board. And so now we're just at the principal level coordination to get those expanded authorities and stand up the Joint EMSO Center. And then in parallel, of course, is going to come kind of the final place for all those authorities will be the unified command plan. So making sure that then is seen through the unified command plan. So we are on track. It is moving forward, and it's very exciting to see.
So Dollar, a question for you that comes out of this discussion is, it seems like a lot of the work you're doing is on this idea of being able to adapt, recombine, present new looks to an opponent. So it seems like, this is partly a function, or partly an EMS capability, meaning you need to have the ability to stitch things together in the spectrum to allow them to communicate and coordinate, as well as generate effects. But it seems like what you're doing is foundational to any sort of recomposability, whether it's just to generate spectrum effects or to generate other kinds of fires. So are you finding that a lot of the work you're doing is allowing recomposability amongst the joint force broadly, beyond just what it can do in the spectrum?
Yeah, Brian, what I would say is that I think we're gaining early insights. We are a year, not quite a year into the journey, but Mr. Tremper said something that I want to kind of anchor back to because it just struck me. So he mentioned that the Army had the opportunity to restart with a fresh, clean sheet, how they acquire capability. And what just struck me is that I think the Air Force took a similar approach in the establishment of the Spectrum Warfare Wing in terms of a clean sheet for how we would integrate and deliver operational EMS capability. And again, I give huge credit to our 4-star leadership and down for having the visionary. General Wilson, General Holmes, all of our 4-stars that at Corona had the vision to be able to say, here's what we need to do, and we need to go ahead and stand up this Spectrum Warfare Wing. And what I would say is that concrete, what does that clean slate look like? Let me just give you our mission statement. Deliver adaptive and cutting-edge electromagnetic spectrum capabilities that provide the warfighter a tactical and strategic competitive advantage and freedom to attack, maneuver, and defend. That sounds to me like a very forward-looking mission statement. And I'm unaware of any other operational organization across the department that has competitive advantage in their mission statement. And as you look to the current, the new National Defense Strategy that talks about campaigning, what you start to see is an alignment. And so going further in that alignment, I believe I've heard Mr. Tremper call it RF in a box. And so if we were able to get that, then what we've built with the Spectrum Warfare Wing is, no kidding, the organization that could integrate and deliver that capability. So you see all these things beginning to align. And I would say for folks that are maybe having a little trouble wrapping their brain around it, what it all means, I would say that if you think about how we do joint force packaging to a strike, from an air perspective, we force package at the platform level. We've got tankers, bombers, fighters, all that has airborne command and control. All those have to come together. But again, we force package at the platform level. What we're talking about here is force packaging inside the skin. So it's at the subsystem and even sub-subsystem level, because increasingly those subsystems are reprogrammable multifunction arrays and software-defined radios. That's what gives the expanded optionality that we can then use. So maybe now, as opposed to doing everything federated, now I can grab my radar warning doesn't even need to come from my platform, because at the end of the day, what I need is threat warning as a service. I don't care where it comes from, because that feeds my tactical decisions. So the option space to get the information that's required to make good tactical decisions in order to prosecute the fight, you're expanding that, which makes it very, very difficult for an adversary to take it away. So that's sort of how the concrete things come together.
And I love that description of it, because essentially functionally decomposing down a platform into its mission systems, because really what it all comes down to, it's a distributed computing problem, right? You've got airplanes in this case, and UAVs carrying around computers, and they all integrate via the EMS. So when we integrate that force package, we're really just integrating computers in the EMS, and the fact that they're carried by different airplanes is secondary to that. And so from the adversary's perspective, that is a highly optional force package, and it's going to be very difficult for them to assess what the right countermeasures might be against it. And to Dave's point, it gives you a lot of options to improve your ability to deliver effects while also minimizing your vulnerability and improve your survivability.
And we can go even further and say, and wrap that into JADC too, because we're not just talking about air things. We're talking about surface things, subsurface space, all that coming together, little bits and pieces off of all of them to compose the specific tool set that's required to implement today's strike. Right. With the freedom and the confidence that tomorrow we're going to recompose it again. And then the day after that, and the day after that, and the day after that, and the day after that. So good luck countering that. And to put an even finer point on it, I've argued that the option space gives us the opportunity to generate near perpetual novelty. And the reason why you care about that, particularly against AI, is that it's not, what I'm going to throw at you tomorrow ain't in your training set, was not in your training set, because it didn't exist. So trusting, being able to confidently trust your AI to counter something that wasn't in their training set is a risky proposition. And that effect in and of itself may be enough to sufficiently decrease the adversary's confidence that they choose today's not the day. Knowing that we can continually expand the optionality space at a cost that's economically puts us on the right side of the cost curve, whereas the adversary has to be able to potentially counter all of them. We just have to need to implement the ones that we're going to implement. Right. So that's exciting. And we can, like I said, we can do that without breaking the bank, but it drives a major disruption, not just in how we acquire, but how we fight and how we think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, Dave, to Dollar's point, are we in, I mean, obviously open architecture is a piece of this, I suppose. Is open architecture going to be enough to provide the agility for the kinds of optionality that the force may need to counter a China, in its backyard? Or are there additional things we got to do to create that agility?
Yeah, I think so. So I'm glad you asked that question. So we've been recently using the term government reference architecture as opposed to open architecture, because I think open architecture provides a lot more flexibility outside of kind of the government purview than we would like to have to enable the types of things that Dollar's looking at. So we've been using the term government reference architecture to talk about things like CMOS in the Army and SOSA in the Air Force and Big Iron as a software development environment, Red Hawk, to point out that, hey, these are things that the government understands. We're going to thread these things together to create the government reference architectures. We're going to migrate the capability development towards those government reference architectures, push them through acquisition processes like the Army is creating for kind of that multifunction software-defined agility, and then tie them with operational deployment mechanisms like the 350th Spectrum Warfare Wing has, and then connect that with the GEMSOCs at the Stratcom to enable the operators to actually manage the spectrum in this way. So there is a thread that connects all the way from capabilities through the operations, and there is a utopia of how those pieces all connect. I think there's the EMS spectrum management piece at the Stratcom, at the kind of the edge of the sword, combined with dollars infrastructure for how they're doing 350th, combined with how the Army is acquiring, combined with how the Air Force and the Army are lining up government reference architectures. And if we can connect those dots across the DoD, it's profound. Now, you can connect the dots. Technically, it makes sense. The organizations are starting to be structured, but now the process has to catch up, right? The bureaucracy that exists has to catch up to enable that to be rapid. And I'll use an example. One service has a capability, it's a benefit to another service. About a year ago, we did a study. A submarine capability existed. The Marine Corps and the Army were interested in that capability. It was an algorithm. All we had to do was transfer the algorithm from the submarine community to the Army community. And it existed at a government lab. It was going from one government lab to another government lab, right? That should be an email, right? Here's the algorithm. We're going to send you the algorithm, and now you can use it. You've just saved yourself 5 years and $50 million of investment because we already have the algorithm. Okay, so what happens? You got to put an MOU. We had to put an MOU in place. The MOU had to be created between the two service labs to allow them to agree to move that algorithm. Well, it took 6 months. Well, actually, it took 9 months on one side for the one service to approve that algorithm could leave their service and go to the other service. It took 6 months to go through the receiving services chop chain. And now a year and a half later, we get the message that the second service has said it's legally insufficient. The MOU is legally insufficient to support that algorithm migration, right? So what did we just do, right? One service just lawyered up against the other service is effectively what happened, and prevented a critical capability from going from one service to another service tomorrow, right? And so while we can thread the dots on how you go from capabilities to operations, and it's a utopia, and we're all living together and happily, we've got processes that need to be fixed. We've got cultures that need to be fixed that allow us to achieve that degree of speed, which all of these different mechanisms are enabling to happen.
Which is a sobering example, but yeah, I mean, but we can see, I guess, the vision for where we want to go. So I think maybe that's a forcing function that could be used to try to clear some of these roadblocks. We can kind of see the path ahead. And I'm interested in your use of reference architectures, so that's kind of often used in telecommunications to talk about how we describe an instantiation of a network, which is interesting because it's different than like setting specific standards and specifications. So by using a reference architecture, it leaves open a lot more ways that you can configure the system down the line, I assume, as opposed to saying, here's the set of defined standards. We instead are going to talk about a reference architecture that's an example of what it looks like, and then you can build other ones down the road. Is that kind of what you're getting at there? It's not a set of specific interoperability standards, or it's like 5G, like the 3GPP reference architectures.
Yeah,
or is it more like?
I'm not all familiar with kind of the historic use of the reference architecture term. In the case of what we're talking about, it's how the government looks at how the standards come together and can be connected for this system implementation.
Got it.
Right. And so it's effectively saying, here's the list of standards, open standards that we are requesting that you use in the development of the system. We see the Army mandating things like CMOS across their acquisition programs. That's really important, right? So if all of their acquisition programs on the EW side are mandating CMOS, then if one system builds a timing card, all of the other systems benefit from the generation of that timing card. So there's an investment efficiency that falls out of that. But I think in the term, when we use government reference architecture, we're really talking about the standards that are essentially allowable for use in the development of that system, and then the reference architecture provides insight on how those standards can be brought together.
Got it. And so as we close here, General Anthony, we just talked about how creating this connection between capability and operations and this more adaptable, recomposable force is necessary to advance the force's ability to be superior in the spectrum. In the work that you guys are doing on evaluating our capability against that of potential adversaries, do you see that as the necessary path forward? Is that we just can't brute force our way out of this? We can't counter move our way out of this. We've got to come up with a way to, as Dollar says, create more options and create more uncertainty for the opponent. Is that the path to superiority in the spectrum?
I think that we definitely we have to move there, and I think that goes back to kind of some of the basic military operations, is getting inside of your adversary's OODA loop, is what essentially what we're talking about. We're just talking about it inside of the spectrum. And so being able to, and if you think about it, I say, hey, let's not talk spectrum management, let's talk spectrum operations. It's being able to dynamically move through the spectrum. So if you're going to dynamically move through the spectrum, you're going to be able to have to sense the spectrum quickly. You're going to have to be able to make a decision quickly on, okay, I'm transmitting here, but you know what, I need to go and transmit over there. So yes, definitely, we have to continually look to be able to do that faster and more efficiently. And I think that just goes back to basic military tactics.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that's a great point to close on. I really appreciate the time that you've all given us today to talk about electromagnetic spectrum operations and the EM spectrum superiority strategy. So thank you very much, Colonel Bill Young from the 350th Spectrum Warfare Wing. Congratulations on a great command tour there. Dave Tremper, Director of Electronic Warfare in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, and Brigadier General AnnMarie Anthony from Strategic Command, where she leads efforts on joint electromagnetic spectrum operations there. Thank you all for being here today, and from the Hudson Institute, have a great day.